You hear about the two guys that were in an accident on the ocean. They find themselves on a deserted island. And the one man is just beside himself. He says, we're not going to live. We're going to die here. There's not enough food. There's not enough water. There's not enough shelter. Nobody is going to, we're out in the middle of nowhere. We're going to die. And the other guy just seemed to be real cool and calm. The guy goes, don't you hear what I'm saying? You and I are going to die. The guy goes, no. He says, do you realize that I make about $100,000 a month? The guy goes, what's that got to do with us being out here on a deserted island? He says, well, I didn't mention that I happen to go to church and I tithe. My pastor is going to find me. I don't like to necessarily offer that stereotypical, gee, if you've got lots of money, resources, that you're more important than anyone. The Bible makes it clear there was a widow that had two mites that Jesus by far was willing to offer praise to her as opposed to those others who offered much more lavish gifts. We're trying to go through this series of sermons on money. It's not an easy topic for any of us. We don't like to listen. You know, before we do that, I forgot at the very beginning, I was going to ask you guys, hey, if you happen to be in the service and have been in harm's way or have served in any way, would you stand to be recognized, please? Come on, you can do it. All right. Very good. Our series, Dollars and Cents. And last week, Shane did a great job of talking about the fact that God is in charge. Our attitude towards money needs to be different from that of the world. We need to change our attitude. Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, verse 12 and following says this, the Lord will send rain at the proper time from his rich treasury in the heavens, and God will bless all the work you do. You will lend to many nations, but you will never need to borrow from them. If you listen to these commands of the Lord your God that I am giving you today, and if you carefully obey them, the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You will always be on top and never at the bottom. You must not turn away from any of the commands I am giving you today, nor follow after other gods and worship them. The idea last week was, hey, more than you even know, God is in control of all of this. And whether or not you make a lot or a little, God is the one that that can make that happen. We want to talk to you today, though, about the use of those funds that God has blessed you with and debt specifically. We need to talk about, is there some biblical mandate concerning debt? What should a Christian do? The average American has 8 credit cards and about $8,000 spread across those 8 credit cards in debt. Young U.S. families between the ages of 25 and 30 are at a rate of 104% spending that much. In other words, they're going 4% in debt every year, and that seems to be typical. I mean, we look at us as a nation, $21 trillion in a national debt. It seems to us that that's just a normal thing. Ashton graduating, my granddaughter, I'm amazed to notice all of the credit card companies that are so interested in her right now. I mean, my goodness, she's a popular girl. They just seem to think that she's a good risk. She doesn't have a job that would support herself independently, but they know that she's out of high school, getting ready to go into college by herself. And so they're offering, one of the credit cards that they offered was, hey, free, no interest at all that first year. Of course, the second year, it's 32%. And, you know, who would fall for that? Well, some young girl that, for the first time, flattered by the fact that someone's going to offer her a credit card. You see, we start off with the idea that we're going to spend what we make. And not too long after that, we develop the attitude that we're going to spend, well, maybe more than we make, but we're anticipating that we're going to have jobs that will improve and our salaries improve and that it'll eventually catch up to it. So what about the Bible? Does God forbid debt? What does the Bible say about it? I think that it's important that you listen. I've got a summary here, and if you do this, you can go ahead and sleep like you normally do, okay? God does not, listen carefully, God does not forbid debt. God does discourage debt. There's a big, big difference between the two, and we're going to try and go into that. Why don't we go ahead and pray, and then we'll go ahead and get right into it. Father in heaven, I am thankful today that you've given us this time together, and I just pray that you would just bless our time. We just pray that you would help us to reflect our love and our adoration for you in our lives, not only what we do publicly here, but how we handle our lives, that we are stewards of all that you've blessed us with. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Several different things that I want you to be mindful of when it comes to debt. And the first one is this: debt affects absolutely everything you do. We know that, but we need to be reminded of that every now and then. In 2 Peter, the 2nd chapter, verse 19, Peter says, they promise freedom, but they themselves are slaves to sin and corruption. Notice these words: for you are a slave to whatever controls you. Many of us don't realize how much our finances have controlled us. We would like to finance certain things in our lives, but we can't. We feel like we're enslaved to some of the things. We've made choices in the past, and there's no way to get around it. And so therefore, we find ourselves a little bit more difficult to relax. Certainly, indebtedness, by its very nature, creates problems. The number one cause for young marriages to break up in the first 5 years, it has to do with finances and how they handle or mishandle debt. So many of us feel handcuffed by things that we have, decisions that we've made, that we just had to have something in the past. I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to getting through this midterm election. I like yelling at my television set, so I go ahead and every time I hear one of them, I'm yelling at someone. And I noticed that a big deal is this: hey, in Illinois, it's indebtedness. What are we going to do about the fact that we're so far in debt? Is there any way out? And I'm sure that anybody that's running for the governor is going to tell us that they have a great plan that's going to go ahead and help reduce that. I mean, have you realized how much that emphatically affects everybody? The taxes like that, it's just an indebtedness that we're not going to get out from under. And people are willing now and are. I know of 2 or 3 that are willing to pack up their family. They've lived here all of their lives, and they're moving to a different state simply because of taxation, which is a nicer word, I guess, for us when it comes to indebtedness that Illinois finds itself. It affects everything. Number 2, but does the Bible forbid it? No, the Bible does not forbid debt. Deuteronomy, the 15th chapter, verse 1 and 2, says at the end of every 7th year, you must cancel the debts of everyone who owes you money. This is how it must be done. Everyone must cancel the loans they have to their fellow Israelites. They must not demand payment from their neighbors or relative, for the Lord's time of release has arrived. And in Matthew, the 5th chapter, verse 42, it says, give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. Does the Bible implicitly forbid it? No. Look at those 2 passages, both in Old Testament as well as in New. And you'll find that it talks in terms of proper ways wherein we loan money. God wouldn't give us a methodology to loan money if it was immoral in the first place to be in debt. So it's important that we recognize there's a distinction between absolute prohibition, forbidding it, and whether or not it's a wise move. The Bible does consistently discourage debt. Number 3, that's the point. The Bible discourages it. Proverbs, the 22nd chapter, verse 7 says, just as the rich ruled the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender. Many of us know that that's true already. Proverbs, the 21st chapter, verse 5, it says, good planning and hard work lead to prosperity, but hasty shortcuts lead to poverty. I really do believe part of our symptoms of being so materialistic is the fact that we've raised children that it took us 25, 30 years to get to a point where we could bless them with material things that they have now. But for some reason, we never said no to them. And as a result, they have this idea of entitlement, this idea of immediate gratification. They do not want to put in the years that you put in. in having the things of the world. They're so used to getting everything that they wanted. One young man insisted, "I don't have a sense of entitlement, but I sure deserve one." Are you with me here today? I just want to make sure. What about this? I heard about an older gentleman who said his wife's credit card was stolen. When he was asked why he didn't report it, he said that the thieves are spending less than his wife. That's a little better. Thank you. Number 4, the Bible doesn't call co-signing a sin, but he does consider it foolish. Why is it foolish? Because the bank already decided that the person in question is a risk, and you better sometimes listen to your bank. Proverbs, the 22nd chapter, verses 26 and 27 says, "Don't agree to guarantee another person's debt or put up a security for someone else. If you can't pay it, even your bed will be snatched from under you." If someone asked you to do something that had a 38% chance of costing you money, a 28% chance of hurting your credit score, a 26% chance of hurting your relationship with your child, with your friend, with your spouse, would you do it? Honestly, we'd say no, we wouldn't do it, but that's exactly what we do when we co-sign. Those statistics are constantly there. It's just not a good bet. And Solomon in the Proverbs says, hey, it's just wise to avoid those things. How many friendships have been hurt because one person borrowed from another? How many family tensions do we see arise even when that a dad or a mom is gone and they've loaned one of the children money and the rest of them hadn't been loaned money, and you've got all sorts of tensions and arguments that are there. The important thing to notice is that 1 in 6 American adults have co-signed for someone else, and they're headed for some issues if they haven't already experienced them. The Bible, when it talks to debt, when it says don't take on somebody else's debt either. And finally, number 5, in the Bible, the longest debt was 7 years. I wish that credit card companies would follow this philosophy, but they don't. And many of them don't care that you will be in debt for the rest of your life if you follow many of their plans. Deuteronomy, the 15th chapter, verse 1 again, it says, at the end of every 7th year, you must cancel the debts of everyone who owes you money. That would be good. That would be a good thing. I think that we could all live with that. I think that God was so interested in helping the helpless, and many people who unfortunately have indebtedness, many of them, God's trying to figure out a way to liberate them, to make them free. J.W. Fulbright said, priorities are reflected in the things we spend money on. Far from being an accounting of bookkeepers, a nation's budget is full of moral implications. It tells what a society cares about and what it does not care about. It tells us what its values are. The Bible says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. If you want to know what your priorities are, simply look at your checkbook. Well, checkbook, I'm not going to say that in the second and third because younger people don't have checkbooks. They probably don't even know what one is. If it's true as a nation, it's true of us as well. I'd like to go to 6. We're talking now the principles about a Christian individual, and the Bible makes it clear. Let me summarize. It's not a wise choice to go into debt. I'd like to talk number 6, though, the church and debt. Is there a distinction? Is there a difference there? Because that question comes up often. A woman came into a bar and she saw a guy that she'd graduated from high school with. She was a gal that was just disgusted with you seeing him drink so much. She came up to me and she said, "Hey, how many beers do you drink in a day?" The man said, "Well, after I get off work, usually about 3 of them." "And how much do you pay per beer?" And he said, "Oh, I pay roughly $5, which includes tip." "And how long have you been drinking?" He said, "Oh, about 20 years, I suppose, just after I got out of high school." So the woman said, "The beer costs $5 and you have 3 beers a day, which puts your spending roughly at $465 a month, correct?" And he said, "Correct." He says, in 1 year, it would be approximately $5,580, correct? Once again, he said correct. She says, if in 1 year you spend $5,580, not counting for inflation, the past 20 years, it puts your spending at $111,600, correct? And he said, correct again. She said, do you realize that if you didn't drink that beer, that money could have been invested in some wise money strategy, and after accounting for compound interest for the past 20 years, you could have bought a Ferrari? The man said, do you drink beer? She said, well, no, I don't. He said, so where's your Ferrari? I say that because there is a double standard that Christians have. And that is that they expect the church to do something totally different and have a different moral standing than they themselves personally have. And I want to point out that the church is you. The church is me. It's people. It's made up of flesh and blood. And there's no biblical precedent that says, hey, we can expect the church to act differently than I do as a Christian person. There is no differentiation. I notice it sometimes when it comes to, take for instance, Christmas trees. Every year there's someone that says, you know what you're doing? You're allowing a pagan tradition to creep into the church. And they're talking about the church building and all the the Christmas trees that we have. Yet, if you go to their house, you'll find out that they've got 2 or 3 Christmas trees in their house. They don't see that if it's a moral imperative for the church not to do that, so also it's an imperative for them. Same thing with Easter egg hunts. I had someone that was just 2 years ago just absolutely livid at me that we would allow some fertility cult to be influenced, that we would be a participant in an Easter egg hunt. And yet those same people at the community park, I saw that they had their grandkids and all of them were there participating in the same exact thing. We try to make the church be something that it is not. We try and make it an institution, and we institutionalize the decisions and the morality for the church when we give ourselves often a break. Those same people say the church should never, ever go in debt. I know that you've heard that. I have. And my question is, do you sometimes make decisions that you go in debt? I'm sure that most of us at one time or another are in debt for our homes or our home improvement projects. What about our car? What about student loans? What about credit cards when we overextend at Christmas time buying gifts for our grandchildren? Often we go readily into debt, but we expect the church not to go in debt. You are the church. If there is a moral imperative against the church doing it, now, is it wise for the church? That's a better question. And I would say that the very principles that we've talked about, the Bible says it discourages that. Does it prohibit that? Absolutely not. Some things we almost have to go in debt for in this unfortunate day and time. Take, for instance, medical bills. We talked about Jamie just a little while ago. Is she in debt? Obviously. She'll never be able to come out of the debt that she's incurred. Is it important that she go ahead and get that help? Yes, it is. I remember hearing a story about a man that came into a dentist's office and he said, how much to pull a tooth? The doctor says, I usually get $100 to do that. He goes, oh man, that is way, way too much. He says, well, if I go ahead and don't do it with the anesthesia, maybe it's $80. He goes, that's still way too much. He says, well, maybe if I just take a pair of pliers and just yank it out, that's $60. He said, way too much money. He says, well, if I let one of my students do it, it's only $20. He says, good, make sure that you make an appointment for my wife for Tuesday. There are times where debt and sometimes the things that we have to pay for, they're essential. Here's the big question when it comes to the church. Crown Financial Ministries says this: it's not the lack of money, listen carefully, that necessitates church borrowing. It's the lack of commitment of Christians to give. Let me say that again. It's not the lack of money that necessitates the church borrowing. It's the lack of commitment to give. There's something different about the attitudes of the early church. If you look in 2 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, it says, "Now I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, that God in his kindness has done to the churches in Macedonia. They are being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor, but they also are filled with abundant joy, which has overflowed in rich generosity. For I can testify that they gave not only what they could afford, but far more, and they did it of their own free will. They begged us again and again and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift for the believers in Jerusalem." The book of Acts says that they sold their belongings and they gave them to the poor. They didn't lose their possessions, but they certainly lost their idea of possessiveness. The Bible talks in terms of what God's expectation is. It sets the precedent in the Old Testament when it talks in terms of a tithe. The word, both in Hebrew and Greek, means one thing. It means a tenth. And in Malachi, the 3rd chapter, it says, "Should people cheat God? Yet you have cheated me." But you ask, "How have we cheated you?" What do you mean? When did we ever cheat you? He says, "You have cheated me of the tithes and offerings due to me." The church, if it's going to have things that are meaningful, if it's going to impact, has to do things sometimes that creates a need for money. There would never be the idea of indebtedness or the need to go ahead and go in debt if Christians would go ahead and pay what God had already asked them to do, the 10% that's his in the first place. Do you think that that's an Old Testament concept? Everybody in their mind, that doesn't know much about other things biblically will say that's an Old Testament concept. We rush to that. Yet Jesus, talking to the Pharisees in the New Testament, told the Pharisees that they went ahead and they tithed of their mint and cumin, the other things that were required. And he said, you should have done that without neglecting some of the weightier matters of the law. He didn't let them off the hook when it came to tithing. The truth is, for many of us, American across the board in the United States give right at 2% of their income. I'm not one that likes to preach and tell you what you have to do. I am telling you that there is no question concerning the biblical precedent as to what God established was his and what is yours. I would rather live with 90% of my income in God's blessing than to live with 100% without thinking that maybe I've cheated God somehow. The church, debt, not a good idea. The church, when it is giving, as the people of Macedonia, there is absolutely no need to go into debt.